My name is Carol Gray. I am the president of the Gray Center for Social Learning and Understanding, and I am a consultant to students with autism spectrum disorders.
My name is Steve Krupa. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Medicine at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've worked with Teach and directed a Teach Center for the past 15 years. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and have been working in the field of autism for, probably first started 25 years ago and then concentrated the last 15 years.
I'm Gary Mesbov, and for 35 years have been a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry. Also spent 20 of those years as director of the Teach program. Currently, my official status is Professor Emeritus. Was also editor of the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders for 10 of those years.
I think there are different ways to understand autism. I think most people these days talk about it being a neurodevelopmental disorder, and most people believe that means a child's brain hasn't developed normally. We don't completely understand how that's happened or why it's happened or what parts are not normal. With that unusual brain development, you see developments, motor development, psychological development, cognitive language development that may not be on schedule, and you also see behaviors that may not be socially appropriate. So there are different ways to look at it, but I think most people believe these days it's due to a brain that seems to be developing a little differently, and then you get a constellation of behaviors that allow us to define children in a category called autism.
In my words, what autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. That means it's neuro, relates to the brain, and a difficulty in terms of the brain's functioning, and specifically in the areas of social interaction, reciprocal communication. And then there's a constellation of behaviors which consists of narrow, repetitive behaviors, difficulty with change. So it relates to the brain, it relates to difficulties in those three areas, and then it's developmental. And when they use that term, that means it starts very early on in development, at a time when the brain is still developing and still quite plastic. So that the differences and the difficulties which occur at that point usually have some kind of lifelong implications in terms of brain functioning, in terms of autism, with how people learn and how they understand and how they're able to function in society.
To me, one of the most striking elements of autism is the social challenge. And as I look at people with autism, I definitely view their challenges as also mine. And I think as people work and play along people with autism spectrum disorders, many people experience difficulty connecting with people on the spectrum. If you look up the word social in the dictionary, you discover that it requires more than one person. And I have always believed and believe to this day that the social challenges that are paramount to autism, it's a shared impairment, and I also believe it's a shared solution, and that it's going to require effort on all sides of the social equation.
Well, when you work in this field, you see autism everywhere. So I think the answer is yes. I think it's tricky, though, because one of the things about autism that most people accept today is, like when I started in this field 35 years ago, it was a developmental disability, and that's all it was, or a neurodevelopmental disorder. But I think today people will also say that autism is a personality type. In other words, there are many people we would not diagnose as having a disability or a disorder who show characteristics similar to people with autism to a high degree. So we use the diagnosis of autism when the degree of difference and difficulty in social communication, narrow perceptive behaviors, reaches a level where those people then have trouble functioning effectively and meaningfully in our society. So a lot of times we do see people who have those characteristics, and when you're seeing them in society, you can't really tell if it reaches the point where it interferes, because sometimes those characteristics can be useful, particularly the narrow, focused behaviors. Some of our great scientists also have those characteristics.
Well, I don't go out of my way to look for it, but sure, I'll notice if I see a child with an adult or with someone else, and I notice some behaviors that I am familiar with. I'll notice it, but when I'm not working, I'm not out there looking for it. But sure, I certainly see cases where I wonder if he's one of the kids I might be working with. I think there are a couple of challenges because you're always working with more than just the person that you're assessing. You're working with a family, you're working with a school system, and when these folks are maybe not on the same page and they've had bad experiences maybe with one another or with others, that becomes really challenging because you really need everybody's input, and not only for making the diagnosis but also for moving forward. And if people are not communicating clearly and they're not able to really talk to each other very easily, that makes the diagnostic process more difficult. It may not be hard to diagnose the child, but communicating to others the diagnosis, what's involved with it, and also what to do about it can be challenging. And then, of course, people have preconceived ideas about what autism is or what mental retardation might be in the United States, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time and understanding to figure out what those preconceived notions are, because sometimes they aren't helpful, sometimes they're not accurate, and part of the assessment process is trying to help people see things realistically and in a way where they can be good advocates for their children or for their students. And it's not always easy to know what someone's thinking or feeling, and that becomes the challenge, trying to figure that out.
I think some of my most difficult situations regarding diagnosis are with very capable, very able women who are married and who have children, and so have really, in many ways, achieved a high level of skill in being able to maintain a relationship, getting along with other people, and also being able to take care of children to a reasonable degree. And sometimes figuring out, very often when you do see them in a diagnostic clinic, it's really in regard to their children's start. Their children come in, they hear what autism is, they hear how it applies to their child, often in cases where we would diagnose the child with autism, and then they ask the question, does this apply to me as well? And sometimes, particularly with women, because they have a high baseline of social skills and communication, the fact that these are interfering with their ability to function, that they're interfering with their quality of life, and the fact that in many ways they're functioning and interacting well with their children, but maybe those interactions don't have the depth that they might have with a person who doesn't have some of the problems of people with an autism diagnosis. Sometimes it's hard to tell and make that distinction. So for me, those are the hardest diagnostic cases.
The research suggests that for those professionals who know autism very well, they can spot the symptoms and be fairly reliable and accurate in making a diagnosis in children as young as 2 to 3 years of age. I have personally made the diagnosis on a child as young as 18 months, but that was a pretty obvious case in my opinion, and it's not something that happens every day. It's fairly rare to see a child that young and to make the diagnosis.
I think most people would say today children on the average with a diagnostician with a lot of experience can be diagnosed between 18 and 22 months. And I think on the average, if you want to think about the public health issue, large numbers of people, that's probably a good target, 18 to 24 months. There are some people who feel like they can do a pretty good job at 1 year. I'm not convinced from my experience that I can do that, and sometimes wonder if they can too, because there are some children that young who look like they have autism and then later on, not because of intervention, but it just turns out they don't. There are just some of the characteristics in younger children resemble some of the characteristics in children with autism, and yet they seem to not still be present when they're 2.5. But there are some children as young as 7 or 8 months who are very, very severe, who you can look at and diagnose and be pretty confident in an autism diagnosis. So for me, it's 18 to 25 months. I don't think it's the treatment that avoids it. So, you could say that. People would say, well, you cure autism. But there are some children even who are on a waiting list, and you see them at 12 or 13 months, and you think, boy, when this child comes to the clinic, they really are going to have autism. Sometimes in our clinics, we actually see them to talk to the mother, because we do sometimes have long waiting lists so that they can be doing some intervention, learning about it in the interim. And when you look at those children, we don't do the diagnosis, but sometimes you can get a pretty good idea of whether the child has it or not. And there are some children you see at that age who they certainly resemble the characteristics of children with autism in some of those early signs. And by the time they come back at 19 months or a year, 2 years, those signs are gone. And I don't think we cure it, and I don't think our suggestions cure it. I just think there are some children who go through a period which resembles autism, but don't really have it.
If I was working with a family who have a child who has just been diagnosed with autism, I think I would encourage them to gather information with a caution that some of the information that's out there, particularly on the internet, may be outdated, may be inaccurate, may not be helpful. I would, in that process of gathering information, I would want them to find a friend, somebody who has experience as a parent or a professional working with children with autism, who can help them along the way in this journey called autism to sort through the accurate information as well as the false claims that they may encounter here and there. I would also try to provide them with some strategies, things that they can do right off the bat within their home to improve communication between themselves and their child with ASD.
I think most people believe if you have a good, solid diagnosis, earlier the better, so that as early as you can identify it. I think that's why so much money and there's so much interest in diagnosing autism under the age of 2.
Well, I think everybody these days would agree that the earlier the better. We're not exactly sure if we're doing what's absolutely best for these children, but the idea is to start working with them at the youngest age possible and trying to put them in learning environments that take into account their challenges and their strengths and try to provide more structured educational opportunities. Children with autism certainly are capable of learning, but they don't always pick things up as naturally as other kids do. So the idea is, if we target those skills and teach them more directly, can we have a significant impact down the road in terms of the child's learning potential and their ability to be independent? Well, I think one of the challenges is that people have different ideas about what normal development looks like, and parents don't necessarily have the same ideas as what a professional might have, and so they rely on doctors to let them know if they're hitting milestones or not. And for some things it's obvious. For motor milestones, there's a more narrow, clearly defined range. For language, the range is fairly well defined. For things like social skills, that's much more challenging because people don't necessarily have clearly defined skills associated with certain landmarks. So sometimes there's a wide range of what people consider normal or not, and parents typically get concerned if the language isn't coming in as it should be, or if behaviors are very unusual for a child that age. But for children with just more social difficulties, sometimes the concerns don't get there until somebody else raises a concern, like a school or somebody else in the community. I mean, it's a complicated question, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it justice here. But there are some signs of depression that are associated with children in general that don't necessarily involve them talking about how they're feeling and talking about what their thinking's like. So children are having difficulty, or nonverbal people having difficulty in sleep could be a sign. Having difficulty in attention span, having difficulty in being able to control their impulses, being able to deal with frustration, being able to deal with their moods. There are a number of things you could look for. Changes in any of those kinds of signs, changes in how they get through their day, possibly could give someone some clues that the child's gotten to the point where depression or anxiety are other conditions that someone might need to look at more carefully. Adolescence presents challenges to any child, possibly because of changes in physical development and hormones. So it wouldn't be unusual for parents to maybe see some changes in behavior that might come with changes in the body developing, but it's quite variable. I mean, sometimes kids show no adjustment to puberty. Other times they show subtle adjustment. Other times they show dramatic adjustment. Children with autism still go through stages, and they still respond to the developing body and hormones and things like that. They might do it at a slightly different way or slightly different rate, but life is full of changes.
I think social stories are beneficial to people with autism. Now, the research bears that out because they point out what's relevant in a given situation. And we now understand that people with autism may take in a variety of details, some of them relevant, some of them maybe not so relevant to understanding the different aspects of the current situation. What a social story does is it works like a highlighter, and it describes those cues in a situation that are important to knowing what to say or do in response to that situation. And for someone who is struggling to figure out what's relevant, suddenly all of those relevant cues are lined up, the connections between them are pointed out, and it makes it easier for a person with ASD to see them. It's kind of like if somebody handed you a tour map of London, and at certain places on the map they place landmarks, photographs. You could say, oh, now I'm here, oh, now I'm here, and suddenly all of London makes sense because you can find your way by going from one landmark to the next. In the same way, a social story often highlights this cue is important, this cue is important, and when you line them up, then it's only logical as to how you might respond or what you might say or do. In terms of the most effective approach to use with somebody with autism, I think there's a lot of effective approaches that we can use to improve understanding. One of the most critical, I believe, is the attitude of the people who surround the person with autism. And people who have a sense of humor, people who are flexible, people who have the ability to see things from another perspective in considerable detail, and who are curious about what would cause someone to respond in that way. Those are the people that, in my work as a consultant, I have found to be the most effective working on behalf of people on the autism spectrum.
Well, statistically, and comparing them sometimes I think is a little bit hard because everybody uses different methods and different criteria. I think that there are a number of educational interventions, particularly with young children, that have helped a lot of people or helped a lot of schools in developing programs. I think the strategies that we've developed to teach, I think, help a lot of children and a lot of teachers use. There's a method called PECS that they use for communication, and I think their effectiveness has been strong. Carol Gray has a strategy called social stories, and I think that's been proven effective with older students. There's applied behavior analysis, ABA, which is used in a lot of different forms in a lot of different ways. And they've certainly documented their effectiveness. There's a strategy that's developed out of ABA called pivotal response training that I think also has shown good results, particularly in the area of communication. But I think also in general, there's a method that we used to call floor time, I think now they call it DIR, developed by Stanley Greenspan. That's an early intervention program that's had pretty good success. So those are I think the ones that come to mind as the first group in terms of those kinds of programs.
Well, once again, I'm going to go with the research, and I think the TEACH approach is consistent with the research. I think the structured interventions, the structured educational interventions, and the behavioral interventions, which follow just good teaching protocols, understanding the child's current developmental levels, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, understanding their interests, and then teaching skills in a step-by-step process, ensuring the child has success along the way, and teaching to the child's learning preferences and strengths. I think everybody would agree those are good ideas. Other things might also be good ideas, but they're probably going to be more individualized to each student. Well, I mean, if you define prosthetic broadly, anything you've put in place for the child that helps them function better, more independently and at a higher level, could be considered a prosthetic. And there are a number of things that certainly kind of fit into that category. Teaches, for a long time, has thought about its visual supports as prosthetics. So if a child needs materials organized a certain way, or needs materials presented a certain way, or needs the environment adapted in a certain way, we would think of a lot of those things as potentially being prosthetic supports for the child in their environment. I mean, I wear glasses, that's my prosthetic device, and other children may need their environment adapted in different ways so they can more easily get through the day.
I think there are a number of things that hold promise and that I think we're going to have to wait and see. But certainly computers have been an intervention that helps children with autism. They are more autism friendly than many things out there. And then certain computer programs, and now the whole iTouch iPad and many of the that are being developed for communication, in terms of activities, in terms of approaches. So I think there's a richness there for people with autism, and one would probably say those are probably the most useful interventions. I think it's hard at this point to sort through all of them and figure out which are the ones that are going to be the most useful and which ones aren't. And I think there's almost too much out there at the moment for people to sort through, so they're kind of frantically running from one to another. I've often made the statement that I think in autism we need something like a personal trainer that we have in our health clubs. You know, when you join a health club, you got all these machines and you don't really know which one to use, and so a lot of people will hire a personal trainer for one session, and they'll take you around, you'll try out all the machines, and then they'll pick 6 ones that really fit you, and then you just go and you work on those 6. And I think that would probably be good for autism, because I think a lot of parents, they want the best for their child. They really want to help their child, but they're kind of frantically running from one thing to another and don't really know what fits their child. Of course, everybody tells them theirs is the best and theirs is the most useful. So I do think there's a lot of potential programs and apps and iPads or iTouches or organizational computer devices that can help these children. But I think we're at the very, very beginning stage. Yeah, we've used a number to program the kids in some of our classrooms, and we actually had a grant to use them for programming the children and developing schedules, and also for what we could call social pragmatics. So we would actually have them rate their, in one of the grants, we would actually have them rate their behavior in class based on parameters that somebody else had set up. And then we'd have a research assistant also rate them and then give them feedback on their ratings. And we had pretty good success with that project if we could get the research assistants. It's messy research because you're working in a school, and sometimes the teachers were supposed to do it and they didn't always do it. So the data wasn't, as neat as if you do brain research or rat research or something. Rats can't stay home if they're sick, but all kinds of things happen in the school. But there was a really, really strong tendency for that to be an effective mechanism, the combination of using that, monitoring the way they collected their data, and then giving them feedback on what their social performance was by graphing their behaviors. And so I think those strategies are very promising, but at this point, maybe we're jumping around too much from iTouch to iPad to this app to that app.
Yeah, I think the technology is very promising. I mean, the idea is that a lot of children with autism seem to process visual information a little more easily than they might what they hear through their ears. And so these multimedia devices where kids have something to look at, they have something to touch, something to handle, something to listen to, there's some thinking that might be a good avenue or a good way of reaching kids in the future, because their brains might be more tuned into these kind of multimedia devices.
Social stories are very specific, and they require us to use a lot of details in perhaps a set of social stories to build a concept. I think it would be possible, certainly, to write a social story about a concept itself, and to start there, and to use one story. The example I'm thinking of is an 8-year-old boy with autism that I was working with who felt that nothing was fair. The rules to a game weren't fair, basically, if he didn't win. It wasn't fair that his little brother was able to watch cartoons during the day while he was at school. There was basically not much in this little guy's life that was fair when you talk to him about fairness and listen to him throughout the day. The story that I wrote, either I had to write 10 stories, 12, 15, about the different situations where fairness applies and the different profiles of fairness, or I could write one story, and I did. It was about mom and dad are the experts on fairness. They were kids once. They grew up. They learned what was fair and what was not. If I have questions about what's fair, mom, dad, my teacher are the experts on fairness. The story basically helped him to understand that adults haven't been adults all the time. They started out as kids, they grew up, they had experiences, and as a result, they have a certain expertise. And that basically directed the child to mom and dad as the ultimate decision makers on fairness. What was interesting is that this little guy did much better. When people said, yeah, it is fair, he'd look at them, they were bigger than him. Okay, you are the experts on fairness. Sometimes all we have to do is, well, provide the information that's missing. I don't think I've ever considered whether there would be a topic that we could not cover with a social story. Every time I think we've covered them all, there's another one, and yeah, we can address that. Even the most difficult topics, death and dying, some of those that really challenge us, stories related to sexuality, etc. I don't think there's a topic that I couldn't address. At least in my 30 years of experience, I have not yet encountered a topic where I had writer's block. I've always been able to write the story that was requested.
Well, I think one benefit of that, you can certainly get beautiful pictures and timetables on the internet, and there are a lot of websites that have that. I think the main benefit, it gives you much more flexibility. And that's what I always say. What I always say to teachers is, I feel so sorry for these kids 20 years ago who had to deal with my hen scratch that I can't even read sometimes. And they had to. Now they go into these classes and their schedules are these beautiful, gorgeous things off the internet. But the one advantage of those that sometimes people miss if they don't think about it is if I were outside of the classroom or something outside of the normal routine occurred and I wanted to communicate to the student what was happening and what I wanted the student to do, I could do that. I could just pick up a piece of paper and write something down because they were used to dealing with my handwriting and they were used to understanding it. But if you have a child and he's distressed or in trouble, you don't have time to go to Kinko's and get on the internet and draw up a and by the time you run the program off and print out the picture, it's too late. The stress has accelerated and you have a much bigger problem. So that's what I think the main advantage is. It gives you a lot more flexibility. You can instantly, wherever you are and whenever you are, you can communicate with the child. Yeah, it definitely is better, and this is not to minimize the effectiveness. I also think pretty and organized and symmetrical presentations of information are satisfying for people with autism, and so it's not to denigrate the benefit of those, but I think if you use those things, and I think you should, and I certainly do, you should also teach the child to, from time to time, expose them to things that you write down that aren't beautiful and aren't elegant, and then that gives you the best of both. So I was responding to the advantage to that, but not really advocating that be the total picture as your handwriting and your schedules.
Okay, the most favorite social stories, the stories that I enjoy writing the most are those describing a concept. a rationale. Why do people do what they do? Why is it that we have children form a line to take them from one part of a school building to another? Because to write those stories, you have to stop and think a minute. Why do we do that? And I love looking at typical people, how they do what they do, and seeing if I can find some of the underlying rules, the rationale that I can then share in a social story. Because if you understand rationale, it, I would think, would help you generalize the information to a variety of different settings. So I like trying to explain typical people to people on the autism spectrum. I think there's a difference between the most frequently requested social stories and those that I most frequently write. The most frequently requested social story from the general population, a general workshop population, would be people, how can I write a social story to get my son to stop doing this? How can I write a social story to help this girl in my classroom to do this? In other words, often the most frequently requested social stories, people want help getting somebody to do what they want them to do. And that's not what social stories are all about. So it makes my challenge, number one, helping people to understand that the goal of a social story is not to get somebody to do what you want them to do, but to share information, accurate information that may elicit and result in a student's, perhaps, or an individual's own more effective responses. So sometimes I guess what I'm saying is there's a translation between what's requested. You have to work with the person making that request to help them understand the goal of a social story. And then you can write a social story that hopefully is going to share the information that the individual with autism needs to make better choices about how to respond.
You would hope that the professionals who work with the family to assess the child and make the diagnosis, you would hope those professionals would be well aware of the stresses that come with families who are raising a child with autism, and that interventions are put in place much, much sooner to help the family feel more capable of dealing with a child with autism, to help the child function better and put less stress on the family, and to help the family figure out how to communicate and meet each other's needs better. I mean, a lot of these things can be prevented if people know what to look for and know how to provide a broad range of services for families. So if a family gets to the point where they're divorcing or breaking up or separating, unfortunately, that's not unusual in some of these cases. And it's not necessarily because the child is autistic, it's because of the challenges haven't necessarily been supported properly, and the challenge of autism is one of them. Children who are going through that, autistic or otherwise, do need some help perhaps in understanding what's happening and in being able to cope with what might be a significant change in their life.
Usually what those families find most helpful is if somebody can actually come into the home and show them some of the strategies people use, whether it's the ABA strategies, whether it's the strategies we've developed to teach, whether it's social stories or any of the ones I listed, but actually being able to have the capacity to go into their house and show them how to use those different kinds of systems with the children. I think that helps the most. It's getting harder and harder to do that because there's more and more families you need to serve and less money to do it with. Well, the internet, I think, is one of the greatest advantages and also one of the potentially biggest problems. It's wonderful having all that information out there, but it's really hard to sort through it sometimes, and some of it's really good and some of it I think is not so good and can be misleading. I think my advice is there are enough good websites from established groups and organizations, I would start there. And you've got a great website here, Autism Independent UK, and you see something there, you can trust it. The Autism Society of America has a very good website, and you can trust it. And the Autism Society of North Carolina is the one I'm familiar with. I think they have an excellent website. Probably one of the biggest parent organizations is Autism Speaks, and they also have a good website. I think a number of universities who have been working in the field of autism also have credible and reputable websites. Yale, I think, has a good website. I think we have a good website in North Carolina. At Teach, I think the Indiana University Resource Center, which has been around a long time, has a good website. I think the Mind Institute has a good website, which is from the University of California at Davis, which is probably the biggest research one. And so that would be my advice. And then you go on any of these websites, they tell you about 100 others. There's one from a grant-funded organization in North Carolina, Do to Learn, and they've been developing pictures and materials. They, I think, also have a really nice website. And then I think once you get on one of these websites, you'll find 400 other websites. But I think that, the thing I'd be careful of is I would start with a reputable, established. There's going to be controversial stuff. I read every one of those websites make me angry sometimes, because I think sometimes their information is not always as reputable as I would like. But I think in general they cite reasonable sources and provide a variety of views and ideas.
I know Teach has some very good information on its website. They're the Autism Societies, local, regional, national, international, I assume provides some very good information in the different locations. In England here, Autism Independent, I know, is developing their website, and I have looked at that, and that has some very good information for families. Specialized university programs oftentimes have some good information that is fairly credible for families. There are so many sites these days, one has to be somewhat careful, but people with good reputations who put some effort into developing good websites are usually credible places to go.
There are many websites with information about social stories. There is only one that I am cooperating with, and that is currently the Gray Center website at www.thegraycenter.org. However, very soon we will have the Carol Gray Social Stories website, and that will be the second website that I will be working in collaboration with, and that will be www.carolgraysocialstories.com. However, there are millions of others, but I would definitely want people to understand that I am only working in collaboration currently with one, and in the very near future two, and that will probably be it for a very long time.
There's one for, I don't know if there are any for children, there's one for adults I like, which is GRASP, G-R-A-S-P, and that's a organization of people with autism who are very capable and are adults, and it's an organization that they have. There are others as well, and I'm not as familiar with all of them. But I think that's a good website, and also very good at recommending other websites.
In the United States, children become their own legal guardian at age 18 unless the parents have gone to courts. with appropriate supporting documents to indicate the child's not capable of governing their own affairs at that age. And then there are different options, but parents may continue to be the primary guardian beyond that point. So there's really no reason to see a specific age as a necessary marker for expecting a child to be fully independent. And with a lot of the children or adolescents with autism, they might eventually be able to manage their financial affairs and other affairs. But if they're not ready at 18, there are legal ways to protect the child, protect the family, protect the finances until the time that the individual might be able to be more independent. So I think it's a little artificial to think in terms of a set age means independence. And for parents who know the law and can plan ahead, they don't have to feel panicked or stressed if they approach this the appropriate legal channels and allow themselves and their child a little more time to grow and develop before they have to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to be ever capable of handling their finances.
Usually the stories are sad stories because they're usually stories, depends on the state or the country where the service is, where a lot of people complain, and rightly so, about school programs aren't adequately funded and they wish they had more funding. But certainly the reality in most countries, certainly in the United States and here, from what I've seen, is that school programs and children are the most heavily funded, and then after you get out of that system, the funds are much scarcer and programs are much more limited. And it's certainly recognized by a lot of people now that these are areas where we need to invest more money and we need to invest more programs. We need to have more programs because you can't just sit at home for the rest of your life. And but those programs are slow to come. So as I said, there are a lot of stories and a lot of examples of families and children who are really struggling once they're past the age of being in school. Well, different countries have different ways and different states have different laws, but basically there needs to be some kind of legal proceeding where a court determines that a child is incompetent to take care of their own affairs and then allows somebody to be appointed, their guardian, to do that. The state that I come from, North Carolina, has a provision of limited guardianship, and I prefer that. I'm not comfortable with the idea, even if somebody's terribly handicapped, disabled, I don't like the idea of having somebody take over all his rights and say, you're incompetent now. And usually in these situations, so you can go to court as many times as you would, but you'd go to court and you'd say, for example, my child's inheriting $1 million. My child won the lottery. I bought my child a lottery ticket and is not capable of handling $1,600,000. So can I be appointed to manage that $160,000? Or you have a child who's got cancer and there's a question of whether radiation or chemotherapy or surgery is necessary, and the child has autism and severe learning difficulties. So that would be a very hard decision for the child to make. So again, rather than saying he needs a guardian, he's incompetent, in North Carolina what you can do is he needs somebody to make that decision for him and to be a person who makes the medical decision about the surgery and then about treatment throughout the medical procedure. So you appoint somebody to deal. There aren't that. How many legal situations do you have in your life where you need a lawyer? You go months, years at a time. You sign a contract if you buy a house or an apartment, and if a person with autism is in a position to be able to get one, I wish more were, and they can't sign a lease, or they feel like they don't understand, then maybe somebody's appointed to sign that lease. But you need it for that. You need it for medical procedures. You need it for money, and sometimes they, it only comes up once a year or every 2 years or something like that. So So for me, that's a better system. I like that system. I was glad that law was passed in our state.
Well, in the United States, they would contact a lawyer, and there are lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing, and they may or may not have to have a lawyer, but there are some court venues that deal with these kinds of cases, and I'm assuming there are people who can kind of give some guidance as to what the families need to do and what they need to do to prepare their documents. So they need legal advice in most cases.
I think the field of educating children with ASD is going to head in the direction of, number one, understanding the importance of social context, understanding all that is involved in its complexity, and translating that into strategies that will help people with ASD read and interpret and respond to social context in a way that is effective for them and the people around them.
Well, I have great respect and admiration and affection for a lot of the parents I've met and a lot of the parents I've worked with. Autism is an unusual field. I've been in it for 35 years, where in many ways parents have led the professionals. Parents have initiated a lot of programs. I still think one of our residential models that we've developed in North Carolina is a farm model. And I was really motivated and inspired to do that because of parents, but professionals, if it was up to professionals, they never would have let us build 2 farms. And of all the programs we've done and everything we've developed, that's the one that more people visit and more people admire and more people would like to do now. The only reason we were able to do that was because of very, very strong parent support. And the only reason Eric Schopler and I, when we started to think about that idea, continued, because most professionals wanted to block it. They didn't like the idea of congregating people with autism in one place. And I think some of the very, very early institutions were called farms, and they were horrible. So I think that has discouraged the professional community. But our thinking always was, and really encouraged by parents, that the life of rural America or rural Britain is really more conducive to some of the needs of people with autism. It's outdoors, it's quiet, you don't have as many transitions, it's more integrated, it makes sense to them. You plant the seeds, you watch them grow, you eat it, and then the next spring you start all over again. So a lot of the changes and a lot of the stress and a lot of the noise in our society is relieved, and a lot of the jobs you do on a farm are things that make more sense to them and that they're better able to do. So that to me is the most dramatic example, but I think in a lot of places parents have been great leaders, and I don't know other fields where has consistency been out in front of the professionals. And wish there were more services, and one of the things I've always liked best about this field is being able to work with them and being great collaborators. So I guess I would just say, keep up the good work. I'm sorry we're so slow in meeting those needs, and hopefully it'll be better, particularly for those children you mentioned in the other question who turn 16 and then there's just not enough.
I think what I've learned from parents over the years is that they will do what they need to do to get through each day. And maybe they don't have to be so worried about the future. Maybe they don't have to be so concerned that they did something wrong. And hopefully they will find people who are going to be helpful and supportive. Hopefully they will have the time and space to be able to cope with what they're being asked to cope with. Hopefully they're going to come to a place where they're a little more at peace with what's been given to them in life and can find ways to find the blessings and to find the treasures and the rewards of the life that's been given to them. But I think they have to allow these things to unfold. and to do the best they can to get through the difficult times. And most parents get to a place where they can count their blessings in addition to the challenges that they've had.
Maybe have a clinic or a place where people go and they can learn, and then to have respite programs so that from time to time they can get a break, the child can get a break, and there's a place that's safe and functional where children can go and for a weekend or a night or something, some period like that.
Well, I think you need to find who the experts are in your local area, who the local autism experts are, and that's not necessarily defined by a certain type of professional. It may or may not be the family doctor or the pediatrician or the child psychiatrist. Maybe it's a school psychologist or a clinical psychologist. Maybe it's a school nurse. Some people in every area have developed a special interest in this area, and they've gotten additional training to know the resources. So usually talking to other parents, talking to professionals that you trust, you usually find out who the people are in your area, who people turn to, and that's not a bad place to start. In the United States, there's a couple of organizations, the Autism Societies of the states and nationally, and also this group called Autism Speaks is providing a lot of resources online for families.
Well, I think those are both very widely used approaches, and it's like a lot of things, it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, we've worked very hard to develop these strategies, and it's certainly gratifying that these strategies are useful and have been effective to many people for many years, so that's part of the satisfaction I get in my work, and I can go to a place I've never visited and nobody else has ever visited, from Teach, for example, and people will tell me how much it's changed their lives and how much, and that's wonderful. That's why you went into this business. But that can also be a